Hello, my name is John Griffiths. I was brought up in Japan, and I want to tell you a story about something that happened to me when I went back to Japan on a business trip in 1997, 30 years after I had left Japan as a child. I should explain that I was born in Singapore, as my parents were on their way out to Japan to work there as missionaries. And I was brought up in Japan and left it when I was 9 years old. I attended a local kindergarten with Japanese children, but when I was 6 years old, I was put on the train and sent off to a boarding school, a missionary school called Chifu in Nanae in northern Japan. And once I'd left there at the age of 9, I went back to do my education in Britain, and I was at a prep school in Derbyshire for 4 years, and then I did my secondary schooling at a school called King Edward's in Whitley in Surrey. So I started at boarding school at the age of 6, and by the time I'd left my family, or rather my family had gone back to, at this stage it was, they'd gone to Singapore rather than Japan. I was 10 years old at that point. I stayed in a mission hostel at Doningtonhurst in Berkshire when I was on my holidays from boarding school, but basically at boarding school from the age of 6 to 18. What I want to tell you about is what happened to me when I returned to Japan many years later. By then I was a strategist for all of Honda's advertising in the UK, and I was invited to take my client from Honda back to visit Tokyo and Honda's head office. And we went back there, a small group of us, and we visited Honda. We also went to our mother agency of Dentsu. It was around New Year time, so we went to their very lavish New Year party, to which pretty much all of corporate Japan would have been invited. On the Sunday, we were given the day off, and so I chose to navigate my way out to Kogane, the area where I'd been brought up as a child, and to see if I could find any of the landmarks of the place where I'd spent a few years when I was growing up. I managed to find the house, one of the houses that we lived in, and I found the station that I'd left from to go off to boarding school at the age of 6. And I also found my way to the Methodist church which we used to attend. I went in there, they were expecting me, and I was greeted by some old ladies that remembered me from when I'd been there last as a child. And I was greeted there at the start of the service, but after the service there was a small lunch put on for me, and a senior group gathered round and we ate together. I remember it being quite a strange day. I hadn't slept the entire night before that. I'd taken the client out to various nightclubs that night before, and when I'd got back to my room I hadn't been able to sleep, so I have this memory of doing my expenses at 4 o'clock in the morning, watching of all things the film Pulp Fiction, and noticing how many Hondas were in the film, and trying to work out if I could use this as some kind of incentive to encourage people to look at Hondas and test drive them. So by the time I got to the church, I was absolutely exhausted and not really ready for what followed. After we'd eaten, they asked me questions about my family and how my family were, and then Haga Sensei, who had been pastor there when I was there as a child and was still there, leaned forward and asked me a very direct question. We want to know, how are you? And we want to know how you've got on since you left Japan. He went on to say to me, we know how much your family life is disrupted because of the work that your parents were doing. We know that you had to leave your family and go to boarding school at a very young age, and we simply wanted to ask you, how has this affected your life since? There was a long silence, after which I said, I can only speak for myself, but I'm all right. I settled into Britain. I completed my education there. I got a job in advertising, which has ultimately brought me back here for this visit. And I've kept my faith as well. So I'm all right. But there are many missionary children who can't say that, and who've struggled as a consequence of the difficulties they had with the families being split up so early. My calculation is that perhaps 50% of all the missionary children I know have had some lasting scars because of the separation they experienced at that time. Haga Sensei listened quietly and until I'd finished what I said, and then he simply said to me, "I want you to know that we know how much you all gave up as a family so that we Japanese were able to benefit from the work of your parents, and we want to say thank you." Now, I'm a third culture child. Japan and Japanese culture was the first culture after my host culture from my parents that I learned, and so therefore I knew instinctively how Japanese, the way in which they were approaching this meeting was, and also the very understated way in which they were acknowledging the debt that they owed to myself and other missionary children. They had taken the trouble to do this away from missionaries and administrators and people who are from my parents' generation, and had taken care to address this directly to myself as one of the children who'd grown up. In my whole life, this is the only time when someone has turned round and said as directly and beautifully as they did, "We owe you. Thank you for what you did." Many things have been written about the impact of separation on missionary children from their families and the consequences of that, often by people who don't really have that much of an understanding as to what happened. But the one thing which is almost never talked about is how the people to whom the missionaries went felt, and did they know how big a sacrifice was being made. On the strength of that thank you, they do. I was told by my parents of a poem written by the Japanese novelist Ayako Miura, when she saw a missionary family, the parents seeing their very small children off on a railway station, and as the train pulls out of the platform, she finishes this very simple poem by saying, "For the sake of the gospel."